anybody was going to be got at, I suppose I'd be more accessible than the others because I'm not bound by, within limits, by radio station management. I thank them for the trust they have in me that I won't play anything or do anything that is untoward.
A fresh-faced John Laws, 26 years ago. Hello, world. This is Media Watch. And we'll return to that burning issue a little later. There's been a great holding of breath waiting for our next explosive revelation. And here it is, at the Narwangarup Star. This little weekly was featured in a recent Australian story. It's one of the last family-owned local papers in Australia. And margins must be pretty tight.
We're not a threat to anybody. And I don't think the dollars are there anyway.
But there's dark dealing afoot. The Star's been receiving press releases from the state's Road Safety Council. Actually, all papers in Western Australia receive these releases. It's part of a campaign to save good West Australian lives. But some lucky papers also get paid advertisements.
How a school gave parents a lesson in road safety.
How BHP ironed out the risk of road crashes.
How Alinta Gas fired up their drivers.
Tragically, the Star was missing out. Its joint owner, editor and advertising manager, Rod Walker, issued an old-style threat to the road safety mob.
Dear Sir, in our rationalisation of client advertising and press releases, we have made the decision that unless advertising material is forthcoming, then press releases will be shredded. Yours, Rod Walker.
To hell with road safety. Don't muck with the mighty Narwangarup Star. There's been other news this week. Sub-editors around the country have made a meal out of the lamb trade war.
Silence on the lambs.
US lambasted over levy decision.
Lamb of hope and glory.
Damn you.
It's about turning a dull piece of mutton into a juicy story. ABC News even quoted a muddled employer.
The richest nation in the world just sort of fingering their nose at us.
A pretty frightful sight if you think about it. Meanwhile, Western Australia is witnessing its own trade war. It's a vicious squabble where news has fallen victim to self-interest. Let's look for a moment at a recent series of articles in that testy organ, the West Australian. It's been taking the Deputy Premier, Colin Barnett, to task.
Premier Richard Court yesterday rebuffed a bid by his Liberal deputy, Colin Barnett, to step into the forest row as the government's Mr Fix-It.
The next day, it doomed his tilt at the leadership.
Barnett short of support to topple Court.
He copped a smack in the ear from the editorial.
Barnett fails the leadership test.
But his real sin as far as the West Australian was concerned...
He chose to tell his colleagues of his ambitions through a national newspaper.
It wasn't what Mr Barnett said. It was where he said it. The national newspaper was the Australian, which had the temerity to start running a daily page devoted to state news.
Introducing Inside Perth.
The page that debates the issues confronting our state.
The news section was christened by an interview with Colin Barnett.
Barnett chips in for top forest job.
The follow-up was Mr Barnett's vision if he inherits the crown of Premier.
Deputy Liberal leader Colin Barnett wants to abolish the West Australian Upper House if he succeeds Richard Court as Premier after next year's state election.
The West Australian has had the local market to itself for yonks. Even a humble challenge can't be taken lying down. Mr Barnett isn't to be forgiven for speaking to a competitor.
Stop hugging trees and buying for the Premier's job and start fixing the teacher shortage crisis in the bush.
Barnett should keep his day job.
When the West Australian bagged its new competitor, it saw a conspiracy.
The coverage over 2 days has all the appearances of a well-planned ambush, with the highly questionable connivance of the newspaper involved.
The Australian explained its connivance.
Having been sprung by the folk from the swamp, we reveal our 3 steps to sneakiness.
1.
Approach subject and ask for an interview.
2.
Ask questions.
3.
Publish answers. Some may regard this as ambush, connivance, trickery, whatever. We call it journalism.
The West Australian was taking none of that lip. and made the next rejoinder a touch personal.
In their scramble to fill one whole page a day with Perth news, Rupert's rejects at another newspaper have discovered the 1980s. They launched their page on Monday with a new column with the breathtakingly clever name of WA Inc. Yawn now.
The West Australian, with its weekday circulation of 220,000 and its fat profits, must be rattled by this encroachment. It's all about someone else poking a toe on the turf of a one-newspaper city. Many hard questions remain to be pressed on the issues raised here last week concerning uses to which the golden microphone has been employed. The deal involving the banks and Mr Laws has triggered 6 inquiries, and there was a mountain of comment. Some had a bit of a giggle.
Listen, anyone from the banks out there who doesn't want me to keep saying nasty things about you, give us some money.
No, it is actually in the journalist charter of ethics. It's I can't remember which.
Ethics. Hang on. Has anyone got a dictionary? Ethics.
Look up ethics for Mr. Moon.
I'll ring up John Laws after 11. He'll know.
That's it.
While a few, like fellow broadcaster and columnist Mike Carlton, sprang to the defence.
John Laws advertises things on the wireless and makes lots of money doing so. Who would have thought it?
The problem, of course, revolves around the style of advertising. Our program showed a proposal to the Bankers Association Council for $1 million plus marketing campaign. The document, dated October last year, explained that the banks hadn't initiated the idea.
Miller approached the Australian Bankers Association at the request of John Laws to see if any banks were interested in using the agency, and in particular, Laws.
While John Laws' mate Bob Miller was hammering out details of the contract in November, Laws was still savaging the banks on air.
When they go down to the bank, Uncle Scrooge down there behind the counter hits them with a fee.
The attacks would have been a powerful leverage to get the banks to the table with the money. But even this morning, Mr Laws showed he still fails to see any problem with this deal.
I just can't believe it. Nor can I explain it.
Not the set-up phone call, pretending to respond to an overture from the banks.
Hello, Tony. Surprise, how are you?
Nor does Lawsy see how his change of heart on the banks, once he was on the payroll, might have deluded his listeners.
It's how I've made my living for 46 years. The banks paid me for my role. They paid me for presenting and producing the series.
Things got distressingly personal.
You've got to remember that the people who are involved in Media Watch aren't what you'd call the great successes of the world. Through my own ability and through my own inventiveness, I have found ways of making money of my own, which is probably infuriating to people who make considerably less at the ABC.
Very inventive ways to make money for sure. And it was all above board, because Laws said,
I don't pretend to be a journalist. I'm an entertainer. There isn't a hook for ethics.
Central to this issue is the fact that the audience never knows when information stops and advertising begins.
I mean, I'm just dismayed. I don't know where the ad starts and where the ad finishes with your program.
No, well, nobody does. That's why they're so good.
The banks were aware of how good he was. Now the deal's in tatters, perhaps they can move on to their next planned step. We can reveal another confidential document from the Bankers Association, which lays out its whole marketing strategy.
Communications implementation.
Laws was pivotal to it.
Third-party laws.
The next phase was to attempt to use other influential voices. Among them,
Third-party other. ABC Regional Radio, ABC Television Current Affairs, Neil Mitchell 3AW, John Fain 3LO, Howard Sattler WA, Wayne Roberts Queensland.
We don't know if all of them have been approached by the bankers, but at least the first on the list, ABC Regional Radio, has.
Stuart Robinson is a broadcaster with the ABC in Toowoomba and tells of being offered tickets to this weekend's rugby union test.
I was invited to an evening out, I suppose, at the test. Dinner and drinks prior to the event at an establishment in Brisbane, and following the test, drinks at a similar or the same establishment following the test match.
All up, PM has determined that at least 3 broadcasters have been approached. None have accepted. The motive behind the Australian Bankers Association's invitations is unknown.
Well, it's known now. A schmoozing of opinion makers. Payola and the radio industry have been dancing together for many years.
The disc jockey I spoke with is also known to have accepted a free honeymoon and part of his house mortgage in return for ad-lib plugs on air.
Lawsy was aghast at the idea.
For goodness sake, one of the most important things in your life is a marriage and a honeymoon. Can you imagine wanting to be indebted to somebody else for your honeymoon? God, I wish I knew who it was. No, let's get that very clear. I have never in my life been offered or accepted anything apart from courtesy and a lunch, perhaps, for playing a record. I quite often get products sent to me by people who obviously want some kind of mention for the product. If I think the product's worthwhile, I will make mention of it on the air and give what is given to me away to my listeners.
His listeners would have been very happy if he'd stuck to that. But what's been a gravy train for years is the broadcasters making direct deals for positive comments. Here's an example offered to broadcaster Wendy Harmer a few years ago.
Re Telecom Australia Advocacy Program.
The deal would mean
talking favourably about telecom and deflecting any negative information. For example, Wendy may have a caller comment to her in a negative way about telecom, which she could deflect by initially agreeing with the comment, but then stating a positive comment in reply. Wendy's radio show could provide her with the opportunity to editorialise or ad-lib freely about telecom, particularly following live reads on the program, or if the subject is relevant.
Wendy Harmer declined the offer, but a grasping personality would have been paid up to $500,000, depending on the level of commitment to the cause. A succession of other deals are now being flushed out, begging to be examined. But the current regulations don't help. The Broadcasting Services Act was introduced in 1992 by the then Labor government. It requires holders of broadcasting licences to be suitable people. It's largely about commercial viability and self-regulation. Professor Hardus Flint, the head of the Broadcasting Authority, explains the philosophy.
It recognised that a lot of the integrity of the system would be maintained by the broadcasters themselves.
We suspect that's why everyone's worried. The broadcasters set the standards, but the current law forgives them when they're breached. Licence holders can be rapped on the knuckles and told not to do it again. And if they're caught a second time, they get a warning. And a third time, then they might be fined or even lose their licence.
That's how the Act is drafted. It's essentially there to protect against systemic breaches of the code rather than individual ones.
In the industry, the regulations have been regarded as a subject of hilarity. Parts of the industry have been on the nose for years, and it was so lucrative, no one was going to stop it. Legally, Lawsy and the rest of the big brand names in broadcasting are probably on safe, if squishy, ground. But now at last, the light has been turned on to catch the cockroaches scrabbling for cover. 2UE is rather belatedly asserting its integrity.
If, as a result of investigations, facts are established which entitle 2UE to terminate contracts, then 2UE will act.
But didn't the 2UE network know what was going on at their own stations? After all, 2UE has earned a mozza off the backs of the Lawses and Joneses of this world. As Laws himself shot back today.
2UE, incidentally, got a lot more than I got, and that's the way it should be.
Laws insists he's the target of a vicious media campaign. He's not grasping the whole story, that his editorial message shouldn't be a product to be bought and sold. It's only fitting we leave the last word to the man whose tonsils must be getting a bit sore.
But whatever happens, however tough it gets, and I promise you it's going to get tough, I want you to know that if we sort of stick it together, you and I can continue to do what we do best, and that's just keeping the dream alive.
That's all from Media Watch this week. Sweet dreams.